guilt and self-forgiveness?
So for our experiment, we were looking at the relationship between age and sex and self-forgiveness and through the rules of guilt and shame-proneness. So a little bit of background information. So dispositional self-forgiveness is the tendency to forgive oneself after a moral transgression. So this looks like it involves a reduction of negative motivations and emotions towards oneself after committing the transgression, as well as an increase in positive motivations and emotions towards oneself after such transgression. We find it really important to look at self-forgiveness due to the number of benefits that come from having higher levels of self-forgiveness, such as increased health.
Okay, so guilt and shame are very different. Guilt is the tendency to blame one's behaviors after committing a moral transgression. So if I commit an offense, if I hurt someone's feelings, I would say my behavior was bad or I regret what I did. And this has been shown to lead to approach and repair behaviors, conciliatory behaviors, and change behavior, which is all very good things. So that's why we call it an adaptive trait. Shame-proneness is the tendency to place blame on oneself following moral transgression. So if I hurt someone's feelings, I would say I'm a bad person, kind of tearing up my own kind of sense of self and identity. This leads to avoidance, offensiveness, and secrecy, which is all bad stuff, and so that's why we call it a maladaptive trait.
So past research has looked at the moral emotional model of self-forgiveness, and this theorizes that guilt-proneness and shame-proneness play an important role in a variety of moral emotions, and for this model, it looks specifically at self-forgiveness, and that worked really well with our research that we were doing. And so an interesting thing is that guilt and shame actually play very different roles with self-forgiveness. So guilt-proneness, due to its adaptive nature, is actually very good for shame-proneness. If you're focusing more on your behavior than on yourself, you're more likely to be able to forgive yourself after that moral transgression. Whereas shame-proneness is bad for self-forgiveness due to its maladaptive nature. If you're focusing on yourself and identity after your transgression, you're not going to forgive yourself very well or quickly. And so a little bit of a cheat sheet as we go through our presentation is that an increase in guilt-proneness is good for self-forgiveness, and an increase in shame-proneness is bad for self-forgiveness. So that'll kind of help as we're going through our mediations and such to understand like kind of how the relationships are working.
Okay, so we are comparing age and self-forgiveness and sex differences in self-forgiveness.
For age, there hasn't been a ton of research that's looked at the direct relationship between age and self-forgiveness, but there has been looking at how traits change over the lifespan. And so we have a principle, the maturity principle, which states that adaptive traits should increase as one ages, whereas maladaptive traits should decrease. And so this is pertinent when we think about the fact that guilt-proneness will increase with age, whereas shame-proneness will decrease with age, and that kind of plays a role into how our analyses are findings.
Yeah, for sex differences, there has been very mixed evidence for significance of sex differences in dispositional self-forgiveness. Research has shown significant differences, whereas they've also shown insignificant differences, and the research has been listed. But we do see in the research that there are also differences in guilt and shame-proneness in terms of sex differences. Research shows that females are more guilt and shame-prone, so there's increased levels of guilt and shame in females compared to males. Which, if you remember the moral emotional model, that kind of plays in how increases in both might be able to like cancel each other out because one's good and one's bad. So there's the math that is right there.
For our current research, we had two hypotheses.
published data set, Dr. Carter's 2016 paper. It was an MTurk sample of 502 participants, ages 18 to 82, so we did get that age range there. Study 2 was a secondary analysis, a confirmatory analysis on a novel study, a novel set of participants, 400 participants ages 18 to 73, so also that age range is present. For self-forgiveness, we use the Heartland Forgiveness Scale and HSF. It's the most popular measure of self-forgiveness. For guilt shame proneness, we use the test of self-conscious affect, which is also called the TOSCA, also another popular measure of guilt and shame proneness.
So we started off looking at the exploratory data set, doing our different analyses, and we started looking at the relationship between age and self-forgiveness. So we found that age was positively correlated with self-forgiveness, statistically correlated. That as age predicts an increase in self-forgiveness, so as one gets older, there's a show that you become more self-forgiving. So you can kind of look at our graph over here, and you'll see that with age increasing, self-forgiveness went up, as well as guilt-proneness, and shame-proneness went down. So it's kind of mirroring what we were expecting to find with the moral emotional model of self-forgiveness. And so then after looking at the correlation and regression, we looked at the mediating roles of guilt and shame-proneness, finding that as one became older, their age was positively correlated with guilt-proneness. So saying as age increases, you become more guilt-prone, and then it was negatively correlated with shame-proneness, showing that as age increases, you should become less shame-prone. And then as you can see, there is that moral emotional model. We see that guilt-proneness leads to self-forgiveness, whereas shame-proneness, a decrease in that means that you become more self-forgiving as well. So the overall relationship between age and self-forgiveness became insignificant due to the mediating roles of guilt and shame. And so you're seeing that those are really key factors in explaining how self-forgiveness is occurring with age.
And for sex differences, also consistent with our hypothesis, there were no significant sex differences in self-forgiveness comparing males and females. However, this was mediated by guilt-proneness and shame-proneness. As we see, females were dummy coded as number 2, so they're at the higher number, males were number 1. And so, since those are positive coefficients, we see that females have increased levels of both guilt-proneness and shame-proneness, resulting in the no difference in self-forgiveness between females and males.
So then, after doing this exploratory analysis, we gathered a novel sample through MTurk, and we were able to run the same analyses on this new sample. And we found, again, that age is positively correlated with self-forgiveness, and that as there's an increase in age, there's also an increase in self-forgiveness. And so we see very similar results of what we saw in our first data set, which is awesome, because it's really confirming what we had found. Seeing that self-forgiveness goes up, guilt-proneness goes up as well, and shame-proneness goes down. So again, we ran the mediation model and found that the relationships were very similar to what we found in the first study, where the direct relationship between age and self-forgiveness was no longer significant, and the guilt-proneness and shame-proneness relationships and the mediating roles were all significant, showing that as one gets older, they become more self-forgiving through those mediating roles.
And same thing for sex. We found no difference in self-forgiveness levels of males and females, and this is due to the increases of guilt-proneness and shame-proneness in females. So they're pretty balanced between the two. The levels of guilt and shame are pretty even in terms of females and males, where males just experience less of both, females experience increase in both. They cancel each other out. Therefore, there's no difference in self-forgiveness.
So for our conclusions, we were able to find that as people get older, they become more self-forgiving. This is due to how age is positively predicting the tendency to self-forgive, as well as the increase in guilt-proneness and decrease in shame-proneness, which is consistent with past research and the moral emotional model of self-forgiveness.
And the absence of virtual sex differences in self-forgiveness are actually due to sex differences in the moral emotional model. So sex differences in guilt and shame proneness. No significant sex differences due to the mutually suppressing effect of increased guilt and shame proneness for females and possibly males too. So yeah, they just mutually suppress each other because there's increases in both, whereas the balance is even, whereas it's not where one is higher and the other one is lower. It's very balanced. And some future directions, we're curious as to what other things this moral emotional model can predict. We are currently looking at different variables, but if shame and guilt play such a large role in self-forgiveness, we're thinking, and these are traits, these are dispositions, and so we're looking to see how guilt and shame also play roles in different kinds of personality traits, especially when they deal with moral emotions and interpersonal interactions. We're also curious as to the relationships shame and guilt have with health and life satisfaction, just because we know self-forgiveness is good for health, and also self-forgiveness is good for older adults, which is what we have seen. But with this new research, with the moral emotional model, we want to see how guilt and shame specifically play their roles in health and life satisfaction. Some clinical applications, we were thinking, especially with the sex differences, that this would be good in like therapy or couples therapy, because you can see how males and females might be interpreting things differently, or they're socialized differently, or they're just like built differently to end up with the same levels of self-forgiveness tendencies, but their levels of guilt and shame are different, and so how they perceive guilt and shame might be different. It might have some clinical applications in therapy, especially working out after, I guess, hurting each other's feelings. And then some cross-cultural differences. So we know that emotions and socialization, it's all different depending on culture. Our samples were predominantly North American, MTurk, US samples who have access to computers and all that stuff. And so we want to see how shame and guilt and self-forgiveness play different roles in different cultures.
So we'd like to thank you, and any questions?
Did you look at how religion affects religious beliefs?
It's interesting because that was a variable in other studies, but we didn't do the analysis for this. There is research showing differences in guilt and shame proneness in different religions, although that is something that we do want to look into more specifically for future, just so that we can actually get some research out and see new samples saying this is how that works. Because when you think about it, religion does play a large role in moral emotions and thinking if you're a bad person or if your behavior is bad.
How do you explain the shame over time? What do you think it is about life and leading some of the religions in this issue?
Yeah, that's where it's a little bit tough. It's a little tricky because it is correlational. It's not really manipulated experience. It's correlational studies, and so we're not getting a longitudinal study to see what events are happening in these people's lives to show what as they're becoming more, less shame prone, more guilt prone. It could be anything from just life events, family systems, where they're located. There's so many things that could occur, and just how traits change throughout the lifespan. I think it'd be really cool to do a longitudinal study. Those are big and money consuming, huge in time, but I think it'd be cool to see how that changes.
Yeah, and other personality research has shown longitudinal studies and how personalities change depending on life factors, things that happen across the lifespan. Most of the change happens when you're younger, not when you're older, but we do see that change happens when you're older too. This could be due to a lot of different things, due to life experiences. Also, there's some theories out there that say as you get older, your brain starts to just focus on more positive affect rather than negative affect, and so older people might just be thinking more of their attention's focused on more positive things rather than negative things.
I'm curious about the graphs that you had showing age and the shaded ghost right there. Is that to be interpreted as variability about a regression line? Is it your confidence interval? What are the shaded elements on that graph?
Those are confidence intervals, I believe.
So it's to show the variability that can go.
Yeah, so the lines are the means of the confidence intervals.
And so there's a remarkable parallel across all three of those as there's an increase in age. I'm curious if you can speak to that. Why do we see that same pattern occur across shame proneness, self-forgiveness, and guilt proneness with an increase in age in terms of your confidence intervals?
I think that's just part of how the results ended up, just because, our confidence intervals are like that because they do show the difference. If the confidence intervals overlap, then there would be no significant difference. Our research showed that there were significant differences, and that as you get older, rank order.